Hey everybody, this is John for MTG Nexus coming at you with the top decks in Modern in June 2023. As a friendly reminder, if you like informative Modern videos, please consider subscribing to the channel, giving us a thumbs up, leaving a constructive comment down below, and if you like red-based aggro content such as Boros Burn, please consider checking out our other channel, MTG Nexus Red. So, we could easily go into Modern and say these are the top 5 decks and kind of leave it at there. The problem with Modern is once you get beyond really creativity and arguably maybe is it Murktide deck, it's kind of a toss-up as to what the top 3, 4, 5 decks are after that. So for that reason, we're going to be doing 7 decks that I believe are the top echelon of the Modern format, starting with Yogmoth Combo. Now, Yogmoth Combo is nothing new. There are different iterations on it, different staples, but the core of the deck has remained the same. Undying creatures like Sternroot Geist and Young Wolf, Yawgmoth for Inquisition and Grist, as well as ways to search it up. And then obviously Mana Acceleration, one of the newer additions to the deck of late. Some versions have been running Arboreal Grazer. The positives of this, obviously, if your mana dork dies, you don't really care. The negatives of this, if you don't have enough lands in your hand, well, it's kind of a useless card. It helps to blunt the force of something like Ragavan, something Young Wolf also kind of does. But, you know, this version plays a little bit more higher of a land count than I believe Yawgmoth played historically, but otherwise your same creature deck. This is a creature combo deck based around Yawgmoth and Undying creatures, with Blood Artisting your opponent out, used to run Geralf's Messenger. Can also do Hapatra as part of the combo, I believe. And then beyond that, you're just kind of this, have a backup beatdown plan of your Undying creatures and Grist tokens, and it is a very solid deck in the format. Unfortunately, it does fold a little bit to the card Fury, but other than that, it's a very solid version of the deck in the format. You know, kind of checks all those boxes of any type of aggressive or mid-range deck. Has to have a good A plan and a good B plan, and checks all those boxes. Another deck that does that the same way is Hammer Time. Now, this obviously comes in 2 colors usually, either mono white or Azorius. But the core of the deck remains the same, much like Yawgmoth. You're based around the card Colossus Hammer and ways to equip it, getting around the equipment costs. Pure Steel Paladin, as well as Sigarda's Aid are your main ways to equip this, both obviously in different situations. Your ways to find Colossus Hammer, Urza's Saga, obviously Hammer itself, and then some number of Stoneforge Mystics. Some have opened the armories and other things, but usually those have those 12 ways to find it. Obviously you have a small Urza Saga package as a decent backup plan, and then you're just playing annoying taxing creatures, things like Esper Sentinel, Giver of Runes. Some versions play things like Manti, some of those are just Surge of Salvation, Blackness, Smith Skill, different ways to protect your creatures. One card that has picked up in popularity is Solitude. This particular version only running 1 list in the main, but this is a card that's been popping up more and more. You have an equipment package besides the hammers, usually Shadow Spear and Caldera complete. Sometimes you'll see sometimes type of the swords, and obviously other ways to equip it like Core Outfitter are always welcome. This is a staple in the Modern format, although it certainly has slipped in popularity of recent note. Living End, another one of those kind of tier 1.5 decks. This is a 1-card combo with your Cascade cards, usually cascading into Living End. The rest of the deck is a bunch of Cyclers or Pitch Elementals that you can easily put in your graveyard. Things like Grief to disrupt your opponent, Force of Negation to protect your spells or disrupt your opponent. And then beyond that, you just have cycling creatures, Architects of Will, Curator of Mysteries, Waker of Waves, Straight Riverwinder, Street Wraith. This version is obviously not only vulnerable to graveyard hate, but also vulnerable to anti-Cascade stuff. Hence why I put it a little bit further down the list than its Cascade cousin that we'll talk about in a minute. But overall, this deck has have a very solid Game 1 canon and can kind of transform into this bad tempo deck in Game 2 and Game 3 if it has to. Sometimes it runs a bunch of subtleties in the sideboard along with endurances. So you play subtleties, endurances, Curator, Mysteries, and kind of have this B-game blackout plan if your opponent has too much hate. But beyond that, it's a very solid combo deck that forces your opponent to respect things that don't necessarily get respected on certain axes. Very powerful deck overall. Probably, I would say, in the top 4 or 5 decks in the format. You know, between it, Yawgmoth, and Hammer Time, you can kind of argue which ones take the 5th spot. But those are solid decks overall. I would say the number 4 deck overall is Ractoscan. named after its ability to scam opponents with evoking Grief or Fury, and then casting Undying Malice or Feign Death on it. Especially on turn 1, this can overwhelm your opponent with a 4/4 double striker, or double Thoughtseize and leave a 4/3 creature behind. Beyond this, it has a bunch of early game breaking plays, things like Ragavan, Blood Moon, ways to disrupt the opponent, and then beyond that, it's just a rock-based good stuff deck with things like Lightning Bolt, Fatal Push, Terminate, etc. Also plays some mid-range cards like either Seasoned Pyromancer or Fable the Mirror Breaker. Then the rest of the deck is just like old traditional rock decks, how you wish to disrupt your opponent. Obviously, this deck has very game-breaking early plays, and then can back it up with some solid rock gameplay. It's not the best mid-range deck in the format, but it certainly has some of the most explosive openings and tries to capitalize on that before the opponent can recover. And in absence of that, can play a decent mid-range game plan, once again having that very good A plan, B plan that you need in a format like Modern. How the Mighty Have Fallen. Now, still arguably one of the more played decks in the format. This deck really hasn't gotten any new iterations of late, that being Murktide Regent. It still does the same powerful things. You have Ragavan, DRC, Ledger Shredder in the early turns. Backing up with Murktide Regent as your late game, you still have the excellent card selection with Expressive Iteration and Mishra's Bauble. The thing is, people have really kind of understood how to counter this deck and to play, iterating on different things like creativity, Rhinos, etc. Kind of really has forced Murktide to kind of decrease a little bit in terms of its station in the format. It's no longer the #1 deck, but still very solid overall. Very akin to Blue-Red Delver in the Legacy format. Not quite as powerful, but still a very solid deck overall, and something you should be aware of going into any big event. Number 2, and that is probably what used to be the second best tempo deck, now might be the best tempo deck in the format, and that is Temur Rhinos. Now, Temur Rhinos, obviously this is another Cascade deck, vulnerable to things like, Chalice of the Void, Void Mirror, that kind of stuff. It lacks the weakness to Graveyard Hate that Living End has. Obviously, you have Shardless Agent and Violent Outburst into Rhinos. Ideally, you want to do this on turn 3, putting 8 to 10 power in play, pressuring your opponent. And then beyond that, you have Disruption for your opponent. Things like Dead Gone, Fire Ice. Mystical Dispute has kind of come into the format, or come into this deck a lot, as a lot of the deck is blue-based, especially the top decks. Force of Negation to interact with your opponent during their turn. An interesting one on this one is Repudiate and Replicate. It's either counter target activated or triggered ability, or create a token that's a copy of a creature you have. You can copy a Rhino token, potentially copy a Fury or a Murktide Regent. Murktide Regent, also another card that's popped up in these lists, just as kind of counterplay to the hate cards, much like things like Endurance and Subtlety, as well as Curator Mysteries Hardcast do for the Living End deck. But overall, this is probably the second best deck in the format. Then obviously the #1, which was #1 last month, 5-color Creativity. Now this deck is simply a powerhouse. You get to play a combo control deck. You have the 1-card combo of Creativity, back it up with some number of either Transmogrify or Persist. And then beyond that, you just play early interaction. Things like Lightning Bolt and Spell Pierce to keep the opponent off balance. Get the dynamic duo of Run-In 6 and Teferi Time Raveler. And then you also get to run Leyline Binding and Prismatic Ending to interact with your opponent. One addition to this one's interesting is Change the Equation, which is a card that's popped up, which it has nice counterplay in terms of being a counter spell. And then, if you're up against, the Mirror Match or something, it's very good in terms of countering 6 value or less. Quite a nice card to have access to. Really would be annoying for a deck like Burn and such. It's basically a hard counter to everything in their deck. And then a lot of the Modern format is 2 cost or less. And then you get to play a myriad of good sideboard cards. This deck can play a control role, can play a combo role. The deck does a lot of things very well. Obviously, it has a little bit of weakness to the card Blood Moon, hence you see decks like Temur Rhinos and Is It Murktide, as well as ractoscan, all running that card. But overall, this is one of the better decks in the format. It gets to do a myriad of different things. It has a very good A plan. Once again, has a very good B plan. Kind of the hallmark of the Modern format. Once again, if you like Modern content, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, and hope to see you for our next video.